I'm going to start the lecture by reading something that Chuck Colson sent out a while back. Every once in a while I read something and it just catches my attention because the implications are huge and they're not necessarily immediately apparent. But this is a story. It was written by Prison Fellowship President Mark Earley. And he says he has a friend named Julie that went away to college, and she made a point of sharing Christ with her roommates, as Christians should do. And they listened politely and seemed very supportive. Julie was excited because all of her roommates seemed very open to the gospel message. But to her surprise, they responded just as warmly when Sally said she was into the New Age and believed that God was within all of us. And then Amy said she believed that God was a force, the kind she had seen on Star Wars and other movies. And Ruth followed up by saying she was a very spiritual person, but didn't believe there was any God at all. But most baffling it all to Julie was that the others agreed that everyone was really saying the same thing. Now see, that's where our culture is at. Totally opposite spiritual ideas, completely conflicting spiritual ideas, and yet these young people have been trained to believe that they're basically all the same thing. Now, Alan Bloom wrote a very, very famous and influential book clear back in 1987. It was called Closing of the American Mind. And this was one of the statements he made in the introduction to that book. There is one thing that a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering university believes or says that he believes that truth is relative. In other words, in our culture today, truth is considered very fluid. It's a philosophical concept. And if two people have completely opposite truths about things, then, well, that's good for them. As long as they believe something, that's all that matters. These same students would never have that viewpoint about gravity. They wouldn't believe that if I believe gravity doesn't exist, and I believe it's strong enough, then that's all that matters. You see, they have come to think there's a complete separation of the physical world and physical stuff and scientific stuff and religious, philosophic stuff. They've seen it as a complete separation. And that's the culture we live in. And that's the people that you all are surrounded with. Because for the most part, if not everyone here, they believe in all or some part of Christian concepts of absolutes. But it is not what our culture believes. You see, there's a consequence to what's going on here as we separate the physical world from the spiritual world. And this is the consequence. This is a Barna poll. It's been done many times, as late as the year 2000. He has went out, done polls, done studies, tracked what's going on in our churches, and found out that up to 70 or more % of youth in evangelical, Bible-believing colleges, when they leave for secular college, within a year, they consider their religious beliefs fluid or irrelevant. They no longer believe in what the Bible has to say. What in the world's going on? How could we get to that point as a culture? You see, America has more churches. America is a country that has more churches, it has more denominations, it has more Christian colleges, more seminaries, Christian radio, Christian bookstore, parachurch ministries, Dobson and Swindoll, and all these ministries, Larry Burkett. And yet, as we look over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, we see a nation that with every passing year is becoming less Christian, not more Christian. Now, God built me in a certain way. I've always loved to take things apart. I've loved to try to figure out how things work. As a kid, I would tear stuff apart and try to put it back together, usually unsuccessfully. And as I look at this, I see a church that it's not like it's not doing what it ought to be doing. It's out there preaching about Jesus Christ. We had Promise Keepers, huge movement among men over the last 10 years ago, and yet in the wake of Promise Keepers, do we see a nation that is more moving toward Christian principles or more moving away from Christian principles? And most people, if they're really honest, would have to agree we're moving away. What's going on, the church is very busy doing what God put the church here on earth to do, which is to speak on spiritual matters, to speak on truth and reality, but they're not tying reality to the physical world for the most part. And the ground on which this gospel message is being spread is becoming more and more rocky and more thorny and more hard-packed, and people are less receptive. It's like the girls I talked about at the very beginning. They just throw that into, well, that's nice, you believe it, but I have my own reality. Why? The Bible, Jesus, starting with Jesus, really put his finger right on the bullseye of what is going on and why we're losing our culture, and why the European nations are essentially pagan nations, 2-3% church-attending, Bible-believing Christians in the whole continent of Europe. France, Spain, Germany, Holland. They're all went from Christian evangelizing nations to the point where there's essentially no Christians there. Jesus said, in the verse that's the most memorized, most famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish, but have eternal life." Just back up 4 verses, and you had Nicodemus coming to see Jesus in the middle of the night, looking for answers in life. I think he was asking those kind of questions. What is truth? What's life all about? What's really important in life? And in the midst of asking these kind of questions, Jesus looked Nicodemus right in the eye. This was the wisest, most revered teacher in Israel. This was the man that people came to for answers. And he went to see Jesus at night because he really didn't know who Jesus was at that point. And Jesus looks him in the eye and he says, "Nicodemus, if you don't believe me when I tell you of earthly things, how are you going to believe me when I tell you of spiritual things?" You see, it's an if-then statement. If you reject the earthly stuff, how are you going to believe the spiritual stuff? See, there's the disconnect. Spiritual, earthly. You can't disconnect them. The second if-then statement. Jesus made this statement also. Jesus said, "If you do not believe Moses and the prophets, neither will you be persuaded though one rise from the dead." And you see, that's what's going on. What Moses, in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible, talked about were earthly things. Where did everything come from? Why does it look the way it is? Why does the world operate the way it does? If that's all rejected, if it doesn't mean what it says, then neither will you be persuaded though one rise from the dead. And Jesus is becoming more and more irrelevant in our culture. And lastly, another if-then statement. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And the foundations of every Christian doctrine are found back there in Genesis. Why do we wear clothes? Because of the sinful nature of man. Where did sin and death come from? All of the basic foundations are right back in Genesis. So how did we get to this point where there's a separation of the physical from the spiritual? Well, what's been going on for the last 100 years, starting in Europe and moving across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean into America, and really accelerating from the 1960s on, is an educational system where we, as Christians, have allowed our children and those around us to be run through a system where they hear absolutely nothing about any of the basic biblical statements of where we came from, why the world looks the way it does, the connection of biology, geology, physics with the Bible. It's all ignored as if the Bible really doesn't say what it says, and we're trying to find some explanation for things that leave the Bible out. Meanwhile, the church is fighting the social issues. We're worried about euthanasia and abortion and homosexual behavior, and they're all symptoms. Underlying those symptoms are the philosophical mindset of where we came from. Christianity is built on a basis of creation, which ties reality of where we came from, the physical world, to the moral, spiritual concepts. The worldview that supports all of these symptoms basically tries to explain everything without God, and coming out of that explanation that leaves God out are all of the symptoms. It's like going to a doctor with lots of problems. You have cancer, it's eating away at your insides, you walk into the doctor's office, you tell him your symptoms, he runs some tests, and he discovers that you have cancer. But he says, I found out you have cancer, but I'm not going to treat the cancer.